I grew up in a really challenging, almost civil war in Belfast in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So I just believed it was normal for tanks to drive down your street, for soldiers to walk past you with their M60s and hit them across your head, for bombs going off every single day. I thought that was normal. First day at Tottenham Hotspur, and I met this guy called Jurgen Klinsmann, who was a German World Cup winner. They've played in the Premier League, they've scored against Man United, played against Ronaldo and Gerrard and Henry and all these guys. Sure, kind of everybody's technically and athletically roughly around the same area to get to that level of a Premier League level. What's then the biggest differential in performance? And for me, it always came down to mindset.
Mm-hmm. My guest for this episode is Paul McVeigh. Paul was a professional footballer for nearly 20 years, playing for clubs in the English Premier League such as Tottenham Hotspur and Norwich City. He also gained 40 caps internationally for Northern Ireland. He made over 300 appearances and was a key member of 2 championship-winning teams, rising to the pinnacle of English soccer. Paul is also the author of the ironically entitled The Stupid Footballer is Dead. After his playing career, Paul worked as a sports psychologist and was the first person ever to play in the English Premier League and qualify with a Masters in Psychology. Paul now works with some of the biggest organisations in the world to help their teams and leaders master their mental game and performance. Paul and I met on the speaking circuit several years ago, and I'm delighted to have him on the podcast to share some lessons from arguably the most ruthless industry on the planet. If you enjoy what you hear, please leave a review, like, comment and subscribe. You know the drill. It would mean the world to me and will help this podcast reach as many people as possible. You don't want to miss this. Enjoy. Paul, welcome to the show. My first question for you. In life, what's the most important thing you've ever had to pitch for?
Wow. You haven't started gently with me there, Dominic.
Not at all.
Wow. The most important thing I've ever had to pitch for. That's an unbelievably tough question. How do you answer that? I'm guessing I'm gonna initially think it's a career thing and potentially a business thing. So there's probably 2 things that spring to mind. One is go straight into the background of I played professional football for nearly 20 years. And whenever I had my first 6 years at Tottenham Hotspur, and it got to a point where both the club and my 21-year-old self realised that we weren't for each other anymore, so they decided to move me on and had an opportunity to go to Norwich City on trial. And I suppose those 3 days in Norfolk and trying to gain a contract was, looking back now, probably the seminal time in my life, because I think if that hadn't worked out, I would have left Spurs, having only played a few appearances in the Premier League, and then it kind of would have been scraping around in the lower leagues, or potentially even going back to Ireland with almost like with my tail between my legs, not having had a career that I wanted so badly as a young kid. And those 3 days trying to get that contract, and ultimately at the end of those 3 days, the manager at the time, Brian Hamilton, turning around to him and saying, "Wee man, we're going to give you a 1-year contract," was just amazing, because I felt like my career was flagging. I'd already had a few years of not playing in first team football. Getting that opportunity to go in and then go and try and play at the high level of the championship at the time was probably a huge moment in my life. But what most recently comes to mind is, since we've both had our performing careers, let's put it that way, at the start of our lives, and now we've moved into a second career. And so the keynote speaking that I've been doing for the 15 years has evolved into leadership programs. And so I had an opportunity to speak with the global CEO of a behemoth of an insurance company based in Switzerland. And essentially I had to pitch for our first ever leadership program. And instead of me doing a one-off keynote where you go in and you deliver your 45 minutes and kind of go off, whether it's part of a conference, part of a overall learning development package, it was my leadership program that I built, that we had this world-class team of people, and it was a 6-figure contract. And to go in to pitch for that was absolutely nerve-wracking, but we made it happen, and I was so delighted.
Awesome. There are so many parallels between those two experiences, and we'll dig into them a little bit later on. If those were the two kind of big ones that tick that box, is there anything that got away? Is there anything that you look back on your career and you think, oh, it'd been really interesting to see if that worked out?
Yeah, I think there's so many, and this is going to be fascinating because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. We almost got selected on a daily basis
Yeah.
based on our performance of training, which meant would I play in the game on the Tuesday or Wednesday evening, and then based on Thursday and Friday's training, would I play in the game on the Saturday? And you're constantly doing that.
Mhm.
There are so many times when I want to play in this big game. I want to get involved in this. I want to do this. And it just doesn't happen for you. For instance, at one stage in my career, I had 2 years at Luton Town. And it was really, really challenging. And again, this is all the other side of a professional sporting career. Most people don't realize. But, we went in the administration. So we were stopped getting paid. Our manager get sacked. We had to sell our captain, our best player. We weren't able to essentially do anything. We were deducted points. But as part of this almost really, really challenging times, really galvanized the team and brought us together. And we ended up getting to Wembley that season. And we got to the final of the competition. It's almost like the League Cup for the lower leagues, but we got
Yeah.
to play in front of 55,000 people. And I'd played every game the whole way through the competition, got to the final, and I wasn't even on the subs bench.
Oh.
Dominic, do you know, like growing up and watching the FA Cup finals from Liverpool Everton in '86, the Liverpool Wimbledon in '88, and all the way through the Man United winning all the trophies in the '90s, and just thinking, imagine winning a cup, imagine winning a trophy
Yeah.
at Wembley in front of tens of thousands of people. And it's what probably every kid that ever wanted to play football, even if you didn't want to play football, you probably still wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And I got that close to it. And while my team was celebrating and going up to lift the trophy, and I just felt so disheartened because I wasn't part of it. Really, really tough.
That's so tough. I mean, and to bounce back from those moments, I think that's where the real kind of professionalism comes in, really, to be able to dust yourself off. Obviously you need to lick your wounds after those sorts of experiences a little bit, but there will be another game, there will be another opportunity, there will be another career path. Even if that's the end of one avenue, then another option opens up, and it's your ability to step into those moments that I think is really powerful.
I think what happens as well, and this definitely happened in my sporting days, is that I think an athletic career is almost like has that parabolic curve of like almost like throwing a ball, and it kind of starts at the bottom and goes up and it hits the apex and the pinnacle of your career, and then obviously there's just a gradual slowing down, and eventually it comes down the other side. And we know what's going to happen, and you can't keep up and you can't compete with younger, stronger, fitter guys. But that for me was the moment where I thought, this is just getting to the end point where I know I don't have enough in the tank to be able to continue to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, after that season of being part of the team of winning the trophy at Wembley was still, a great feeling, but not being on the pitch and not being involved in it was still tough to take. And then it was my next season, which turned out to be my last season, to then go and play back at my team that I had 7 or 8 of my kind of most successful years in my career at Norwich City.
Yeah.
And amazingly, we won the league in my last season. And I think for me, that was the point of going, I've kind of done everything I've ever wanted to do. I've played in the Premier League, I've scored against Man United, played against Ronaldo and Gerrard and Henry and all these guys. I've won a trophy at Wembley, even though I wasn't really involved in it. The second league title. And I also know it's time to stop, because there was one moment in the season, I was actually in training, where we were playing in this like almost like a really tight 5-a-side game. And I went in for a tackle, this real like 50-50 tackle, this young kid, 17, 18-year-old kid called Corey Smith. And we both went, we knew it was going to be rough, and we both had to go 100% into it. And we smashed into each other, both fell on the floor, and the ball kind of trickled a few feet away from us. And I remember both of us trying to get up off the ground, because you're kind of on your back and trying to get up off the ground to go and get it. And he get up and he got the ball, and he just kept going further and further. And at the point where I just stopped running after him, and in my head I was like, that's it. time. This is the end.
Uh,
I came to the end of the season, and I was like, "Yep, I'm done."
time to hang up the boots. I hadn't really considered it before, actually, but you kind of made me think that as a professional footballer, you're pitching like all the time, not only to get into the team, but while you're on the field, you've got to play at that level. Otherwise, the manager's going to go right off someone else on. We need to score a goal, especially in your position. If you're
Yeah.
not putting the ball in the back of the net, or at least helping get the ball up the field, then you're not serving your function.
So tell me this. This is the and it's hard to compare what people do in their kind of day-to-day lives, day-to-day jobs in terms of performance versus what you did for a long time and what I did for nearly 20 years. And I just think if I switched off in my role for, let's say, 5 seconds. So if I'm standing with my man on, let's say, our 18-yard box, their 18-yard box, doesn't matter where you are on the pitch, for 5 seconds, if I just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, my man is probably 50 to 60 yards away from me
Yeah.
and probably will create an overlap, which means someone else now has two men against them, which means I'm not doing my job, will probably end up on a goal or could end up on a goal.
Mm-hmm.
We lose the game because for 5 seconds, I don't do my job.
Yeah.
Now, that must be exactly what you're like, because if you're on stage and you're in front of an audience and you're about to deliver your line, and for 5 seconds you don't,
Yes.
well, it could be the most dramatic pause ever.
It could be, yeah.
Or everyone might go, yeah, he's forgotten.
Yeah, he's off. Yeah.
And the problem is, if you do that in certain industries, it's over. You just you don't have that off button. And I think that's what's really hard to try and bring people into your world to say, do you know how hard it is? And by the way, you're not just doing this for 5 seconds while you're sitting at your desk and those 5 seconds don't mean anything to your colleagues you're working with. In my world, we had anything from 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 75,000 people playing at Old Trafford.
Yeah.
Not just me, my teammates, coaching staff. It's the 10,000 that have travelled up from Norfolk up to Manchester. It's all of the rest of it. And I think that's the magnitude of just how challenging it is. So when you're talking about pitching, the question kind of threw me at the start, because I'm thinking, do you pitch for business? Are you pitching for when I was trying to get a contract at Norwich City or with the insurance company? But actually, it's just pretty much everything you do.
Yeah.
It's all comes back to you selling you, whether it's in your personal life or in your professional life.
Absolutely. Paul, take me back. You've had a really successful career as a footballer. You got 40 caps internationally for Northern Ireland. You've also got a master's in psychology. You've written a book. You work with some of the biggest companies in the world. What did you want to be as a kid? Did you always have that kind of football bug, or was there something else that was a passion there?
I think it's really almost funny to me whenever I look back and think the amount of times, Dominic, I sit and almost scratch my head and go, how did I end up in this position? Like, how is this possible? But I think one of the things that you gain almost like as a characteristic growing up in Belfast, where I grew up, and specifically in West Belfast, we have something where we call it a brass neck. I don't know if you've ever heard of that phrase, but it's pretty much, it almost translates from sort of what way we would call it is you have no shame in asking for anything. So it's a bit like, yeah, somebody wants to do that for me. Yeah, no problem. It's a bit like, you check into a hotel and they're going, oh, Mr. McVeigh, you've booked our presidential suite. I'm like, yes.
Definitely.
Whatever it is, you're like, yeah, let's go with that because it's going to be good fun. Or if it's not, it'll be a good story to tell. And I think just having that mindset growing up was, I didn't really think about ever I wanted to be a footballer. I just thought I really love playing football. And I don't know what you were like when you were growing up, Dom, but every single kid in our street just played football. We go to school and when we come back, people are going, what should we do? Should we play football? Okay. And it's kind of just something we did constantly. So you could have the same conversation with 1,000 other kids who grew up in Belfast, and they'd all say the exact same thing, and they did what I did growing up, which is you go to school, you come back and play football. And so that was really funny that it was just what everybody was doing. And obviously, so I've got a friend now who's one of my best friends, who's the dean of Sheffield Hallam. But whenever he was growing up, he just wanted to play football like I did.
Yeah.
So interesting, because we have this background of it was really enjoyable. It burned all our energy. It didn't cost anything apart from having a football. It was such a brilliant way to grow up. And then, of course, someone from Tottenham Hotspur came across and said, by the way, would you like to come on trial with Tottenham Hotspur? So that was probably going back even further to one of the first times I pitched. And
Yeah.
I walk into, Tottenham Hotspur's training ground over in Mill Hill in North London. And I'm there with like some of the biggest names in the world of football. Paul Gascoigne, Gary Lineker, Terry Venables, and Teddy Sheringham. And I'm just going, this is crazy. And then because that was the start point, it was almost the opening up the possibilities of, it wasn't just these guys running around on a little screen in your home anymore. I was actually speaking to Paul Gascoigne. I actually did an advert with Paul Gascoigne that went in after the 1990 World Cup, which is another story. I went in and met Terry Venables, and you see why he was so charismatic and why people loved him and wanted to play for him. And suddenly it was like you could see the pathway. And do you know that phrase about how, you can't be what you can't see? So relevant now with lots of different, opportunities that haven't been there historically for lots of different demographics. But for me, straight away, I was like, oh yeah, you just come over and you train and then you go and play in White Hart Lane on a Saturday.
And did you presumably had to leave home and go over and, stay in a dormitory somewhere with all of the other players? So that a big shift at a young age to make that decision, like, yes, I'm going to do this.
Yeah. And you're calling it a big decision, but it was also such a simple decision.
Right.
So the start point was at 11 years old. A Tottenham Hotspur scout saw me training in Belfast and said, can we bring you across? I went across for a couple of weeks, and just every school holidays I'd keep going across. And then at 16, they offered me a contract and said, do you want to have a 2-year? It was called a YTS, almost like a training scheme, like an apprenticeship. Yeah. And so we did that for 2 years. And because it was, even though you were only earning £26 a week, but like you said, they put you up in digs and lived with a family with a couple of other players. But it was such a straightforward decision. But I think what's the really key point to think about all this was it was almost in complete ignorance that I had no idea what I was stepping into. Because my first day at Tottenham Hotspur, when I did come over, and I've left my family and friends behind over in Belfast, and I didn't realise and I didn't understand why my mum was crying her eyes out just watching me leave as a 16-year-old. But it was, of course, because she was a 40-year-old woman and she knew that her son was never coming back. And your 16-year-old kid, if you have kids, think about your 16-year-old kid leaving home. It's like, that's a big decision. So the fact that I just want to go and play football and I have an opportunity, it was a no-brainer to me. Then I turned up in July 1994 at White Hart Lane for my first almost full-time job, first day on the job. And I met this guy called Jurgen Klinsmann, who was a German World Cup winner.
Yeah.
And he'd been the star of the USA 94 World Cup, and Spurs had signed him. And because the first team weren't back in training, all of the youth team players had to go in and train with Jurgen Klinsmann for the press, for the photos, and, to get all the media shots. But what was amazing about this whole scenario was all of the players that I was with, all the 16-year-old lads from London and Scotland and Wales, etc., were all buzzing. They were so happy to be training with Jurgen Klinsmann, going, this is amazing, he's a World Cup winner. But in my head, the other element of growing up in Belfast, for rightly or wrongly, I think I had a huge inferiority complex. And I didn't realise that just because I talked differently and because I was possibly the smallest player in the team at the time, and I'm only 5'6", so to walk in to these guys who were just huge athletes was such a massive, almost like punch in the face, to go, if Jurgen Klinsmann is the benchmark of what you're trying to achieve, and if that's what you wanted to be in terms of a professional footballer, a Premier League footballer, or an international footballer, and that's what you have to do, there is no way in the world you're ever going to do that, son. And this is the conversation I'm having in
your head.
Which is really sad because nobody said this to me.
And did you have any, support with that sort of thing at the time? Was there mentorship? Were there sports psychs working with you and helping you to get the kind of head game sorted?
No, nothing. Literally nothing. I think that is, and probably the sad indictment of this whole thing is that 30 years later, I'd say it's very similar.
Really?
Most players do not work on a one-to-one basis with a sports psychologist. Even the fact that whenever I stopped playing in 2010, I worked as a sports psychologist for 7 years with Premier League clubs. And even in 2010 to 2017, in my opinion, it was still the lowest priority at a football club. They'd go, right, we need to get them training. We need to get them into the gym. We need to get them eating the right food. We need to get them hydrated. We need to test their hydration. We need to do all of this stuff. We need to get them doing yoga. But if there's a change in the itinerary or something has to be bumped, then the sports psych session's moving. And I was just thought, what a shame. You've got these incredible athletes, these incredible people, and some of the players I worked with were really amazing. And yet they just didn't have the support from that side because the club, in my opinion, never made it a priority.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because it seems in a business context now that the idea of performance mindset and being able to manage your own resilience is becoming much more mainstream. So it's fascinating that in a sports context that hasn't evolved in the same way. Take me back to those early days at Tottenham Hotspur. What was it like to earn your first cap? Like to walk out on stage? Like, how do you manage the nerves in that sort of environment? Because that must be huge.
I'm glad that you're bringing all these acting analogies out of walk out on stage at Anfield.
Yeah.
Yep. So we play on pitches, Dominic, and you're on a stage, and it's sort of like a wee bit of theatre, sometimes
it is, yeah.
It goes up, and there's definitely.
I've seen some of those people fall after a tackle. There's a lot of acting going on. I mean, come on.
Which is so ironic because the Jurgen Klinsmann story, whenever he first came, because he had such a reputation of being a diver, and people always thought he'd throw himself down. And his first goal he scored away at Sheffield Wednesday on the first game of the season in 1994. He scored this great header, and then he ran off, and him and Teddy Sheringham had arranged this celebration where they're both going to do a dive as their celebration. It's amazing. That's where everybody does the dives now from football. Anyway, going back to it, I would say that I don't think there is anything in the world that can prepare you to play. From in my experience, my first game was at Aston Villa. So it was at Villa Park in front of, I think it was about 43,000 people there on the day. Now, considering I had 2 years in the youth team where we might have had 50 people, 100 people watching us at the time for those 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had a first year as a professional, and we were playing, let's say, in the reserve team where you might have had 500 people might have come to watch you. And then my first ever game in the Premier League was away at Aston Villa in April 97. The striker for Villa at the time was a guy called Dwight York, who went on to win the treble with Manchester United. Their two centre halves were Ugo Ekiog, God rest his soul, who's not with us anymore, and Gareth Southgate. And the two of them, Ugo ended up becoming a really good friend of mine. And the two of them, Ugo and Gareth, literally kicked me all over the park for 90 minutes. So it's really funny whenever I see Gareth Southgate being interviewed, on TV now, and how he comes across. And everybody, he's such a nice guy.
Lovely guy.
Lovely guy. And I'm like, well, whenever he stuck his boot into my backside and then turned around and said, welcome to the Premier League on the first day, I was like, okay, he knows I'm making my debut. But it was just really, really tough. And it's funny because it's literally a case of sinking or swimming.
Mm-hmm.
You either can rise to the challenge of playing in this. For me, it was like walking out of the Coliseum. You have 40,000 people literally baying for blood. Let me rephrase that. Walking out in front of 40,000 people, metaphorically.
Yeah.
They weren't obviously trying to kill me, but the
It felt
verbal,
like it.
yeah, it felt like it. And
Mm.
in my head, and I think this is what the challenge is, in your head, it feels like it's a life or death situation,
Hmm.
which of course is why your brain goes into this fight or flight, or potentially freeze mode. Unfortunately for me, I had a really good game. Played that game. The next game we played away at Anfield, so up at Liverpool again, such an iconic place to go to play in front of the Cop, and have that as my second appearance in front of probably, I don't know, 48,000. And then my third appearance that season, my final appearance for Spurs, was the last game of the season in the 96-97 season, and I managed to score on my home debut against Coventry City. And it's just like, you've been doing this for so long. Even at that stage, I'd probably been playing football for 14, 15 years.
Mm.
And score in front of, I don't know, 30,000 people at White Hart Lane on your home debut. My dad had flown over from Belfast to come and watch, was just absolutely sublime.
It's amazing though, because those moments, they are huge, and most people won't ever face that kind of size of audience, that many people watching them. But even on a micro level, walking into a meeting room with your boss and your boss's boss, and having to share the project that you've been working on, or to sit down with your line manager and ask for a pay rise. Yeah, all of these things trigger the same primal responses in us as human beings, and to be able to manage yourself in those moments, to have prepared properly, because I'm guessing, and I am not a footballer, but I'm guessing that you're doing your physical warm up, you're trying, even if you don't have the sport of a sports psych, you're getting your head into that right zone. You've got kind of a level of visualization going on about what you're looking to achieve. That all contributes to you being able to not get rid of the nerves. I mean, certainly from my experience as an actor, and now, speaking in front of audiences at conferences and those sorts of things, there's always a level of nerves there. But I think of that as energy, and I think, how do I channel that energy into the task at hand, into inspiring this group of people, or into putting the ball in the back of the net?
Yeah.
What kind of part did visualization play for you in terms of goal scoring? I understand that you have a little bit of a favorite spot to put the ball.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating, because when you're saying that about the preparation, it was because I'd been training for 3 years with Tottenham Hotspur, and the amount of times you've pushed yourself, what I thought was beyond my limit, physically, mentally, emotionally, you know, dig it in for the team, because you feel like you've got a little bit extra in the tank when you see one of your friends is really down on it. And I think that's where it comes from. So there was obviously some sort of talent or ability, combined with lots of hard work and lots of real mental strength of going, I'm going to make this happen. So yeah, interesting when you're talking about the visualization. It was actually, it started from a conversation I had with my mum when, I'd phone home every Sunday, just to catch up with my parents and see what was happening. And I remember one time my
I'm
mum,
just going to caveat that for younger listeners. We didn't have mobile phones back then. You couldn't, it wasn't that Paul didn't like his mum. He just, he had to go and put money in the payphone. So.
and it's funny, the house that we were living in, because it was for young footballers, they actually had a payphone that we had to put money
There you
in, but
go.
had to go outside to find a red phone box. But it was the conversation when she turned around and said, Paul, I think you should try yoga. And I just automatically thought, and naively thought, what, in a church hall with a bunch of middle-aged women? I'm only 17. But that was the impression that I thought yoga was happening. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I thought people were doing if you're going to do some yoga. And she goes, but it's really good for your reducing your injuries. Would that help your football? I thought, yeah. And she goes, and it's really good to build up your strength. Would that help your football? I was like, yeah. She goes, and it's really good for increasing your flexibility. Would that help your football? So it was almost like she was building a case of why I should do it, until eventually I just thought, why not? Just, okay, let's give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
If you've caveated the phone call, I don't know how you're gonna explain this one. So I went and bought a video.
No, can't explain that. You look on YouTube.
On YouTube of watching this yoga instructor going through all these exercises, this routine, and it was what I was doing every day before training. But the same kind of conversation happened with my dad when he said, Paul, I think you should try visualization.
Mm-hmm.
And no idea about it. And he said, listen, he was a big golf fan. He says, Jack Nicklaus, best golfer in the world, before he plays every shot, used to visualize where he wanted the ball to go. So I thought, again, okay, I'll try it. So I started doing these visualization exercises. And ultimately, all I was doing was I was sitting in my bedroom in the digs that I was staying in North London. And I was going through a scenario of what I wanted to happen on the pitch. So that was me. And because I was a striker and attacker at the time, I imagined myself getting the ball on the left hand side of the field, cutting into around the edge of the 18-yard box and trying to curl it in the far top corner. Now, I don't know why that came to me, Dominic. I don't know why I only had one scenario. I don't know why I just stuck with that and kept going over and over and over. But that's what I did. And what was really, really interesting about this is I didn't not just do it for, a couple of weeks and stop it after a while. I did it week after week, month after month, season after season for probably about 6 or 7 seasons of my career. But I didn't just do the visualization. I then went on to the training field, and after we'd had our 2 hours training in the morning, I then had some lunch. I then go back out in the afternoon, and I would take, let's say, a bag of 10, 15 balls and go out and I'd physically try and practice the visualization exercise that I'd been mentally rehearsing. Now, it's probably quite a long-winded story, but the reason why I'm saying it's so important for me is because that one visualization exercise and scenario, whenever I look back at the end of a 20-year career, what was the goal that I scored most out of all the goals I scored in my career? Which goal did I score most? Wasn't headers, they weren't tap-ins, they weren't anything other than getting the ball on the left-hand side of the field, cutting into the 18-yard box and curling in the far top corner. And that just kind of blows my mind. That's really fascinating to go, well, is it because I did the visualization that makes me the reason why I scored those goals? And I think one of the things I benefited from doing my masters was trying to have an understanding of critical analysis or critical thinking, and is it the reason because of the visualization? I think it's impossible to answer, but probably a better way to ask the question or to frame the question is, was it a coincidence that the one scenario that I visualized over and over and over and then physically went and practiced was the one goal that I scored the most in my career? That for me just says it all.
Yeah.
And then just the last little caveat, going back, and the reason why I mentioned the yoga story at the start as well was because after 20 years of doing yoga all the way through my career, I left a really, really challenging, physically demanding career, and I had one muscle injury.
Wow.
And even that one muscle injury happened in pre-season because we did a shooting session, which is really explosive.
Mm-hmm.
We probably would have done it because it was probably too early in the training cycle. And that was where I got the thigh muscle injury. So again, these are the kind of things where you think, is it about preparation? Is it about natural ability? Or is it about just adding to what you've already got, learning, and then that continuous improvement of just searching for excellence?
And I think that it's really interesting that there's a combination of visualization and practice there. There's lots of neuroscience research going on at the moment into the power of visualization and how we essentially create things. And I think there's an argument to say that everything that has ever been created by human beings was first imagined. The water bottle that you're drinking out of now, someone had to imagine what that looked like before they prototyped it, before it arrived. But I think in the performance field, especially when we're taking the skills that you and I share and putting them into the workplace, there's that visualization element for sure. But then there's the practice, and I believe that you could have sat on your bed for as long as you want. Well, let's take you out of the equation. I could, with no natural footballing ability, could sit on the end of my bed as long as I want and think about running, cutting across, putting the ball in the top corner. But unless I go out and practice that as well, it's only going to be a reality in my mind. So there's the kind of thinking and the doing.
And I'd also just before we move on, I'd also just throw the other side of this is that you could probably argue, based on the fact that Spurs scouted me at 11, that I might have had slightly more ability than other players, even though I was the smallest player around. But actually, for what we do now, and it's different in your world because your entire world was about performance, it was about projecting, it was about, how you kind of come across, how you hold yourself, body language, etc., intonation. For 20 years, Dominic, I never spoken in public.
Yeah.
Got to the end of my professional footballing career, and at 32, I opened up this world of keynote speaking, and I thought I'd really like to do that, but I've never done it before. And so I literally started from step one.
Mm-hmm.
To go from what I did of never having done it, I had to push myself so far out of my comfort zone. And because I didn't have the neural pathways, I hadn't done the visualization, I had done nothing around affirmations of all I could think was, this is so uncomfortable and I'm so bad at it. Which is not a great affirmation to have.
Yeah.
But to go from that point in 2010 to then go, right, okay, how can I go and learn from people who have done this? How can I go and speak to audiences? How can I get in front of the sort of the senior leaders? To 15 years later, to be able to go and say, I've spoken for Microsoft and Cisco and KPMG and PwC and Deutsche Bank and delivering leadership programs around the world. It is the single most proud thing I've done in my life because I started with no experience and zero ability.
Yeah. But I bet you put in some work. I bet it didn't happen overnight.
That's the only thing I know how to do.
Yeah.
I only know every day, push yourself, work hard, learn from the people who are already doing it really well. It's the simple strategy.
So you do a lot of work with teams, and when I think about a football pitch, there must be a huge amount of ego on the field. How do you channel that individual excellence into a high performing team?
Common goal. It's what is it that we're all working towards? Because you're right, the egos in football are, well, I think they're out of control. And I'll also, I'm not saying this as if like I'm innocent of this. I had a ridiculous ego whenever I was younger, especially whenever I was, 19 and you get your first 6-figure contract from Spurs, and then you get your first house, and then you get your first car, and then you get your first whatever, all these kind of material things that happen as a result of playing in the Premier League at a very early age. The ego is so huge. Now, there's a good side of this and a bad side. The good side is, from a life perspective, I've almost lived my life back to front because very early on in my career, probably in my early 20s, I had worked out and learned that for me, it doesn't really matter what house you live in. And it actually doesn't matter what car you drive or how many knots you have in your bank account, because it makes no difference to your happiness. Now, you might get a certain amount of pleasures from holidays or driving certain cars or living in certain places. But from my point of view, it makes no difference to your happiness. And I learned that from 2021, whereas I see so many people working to try and get up this career ladder and try and get to the highest level and get promotions and job titles and earning certain salaries. Because I'm observing, I'm not judging people. I see that people think, when I get to here, then I'll be happy. Or when I pay my mortgage off, or when my kids leave and they go to university or leave the house, then I'll be happy. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. Happiness is just a decision. So that was the good thing from having this at the start. The bad thing was that I thought I was invincible, and people around me thought they were all invincible. So because we all had these egos, it helps you perform, but it also gets in the way of what you want to achieve. And I think the only way you can bring the teams together is through this, what are we actually working towards? And of course, for us, it was always around how can we actually win games, which ultimately will help us to try and win the league.
Yeah. And who's responsible for that within a team, and not just within a football team, but, in your opinion, within a high performing team? Is that a goal that the leader, the coach, the manager sets, or is that a goal that is arrived at as a collective? What's the buy-in process that needs to happen there for it to be effective?
I think it's probably similar to what the director would have done for you. It's like the director's going, this is what we're doing, do it like this, and we need you to perform at this level. I've got a good friend who's the artistic director of Les Miserables, and he goes and sits and watch every night and sees okay, that person isn't doing their job to the level we need them to,
Mm-hmm.
or someone in the costume department hasn't done their job to the level they need to. And there has to be someone, in my opinion, at the top, whether it's one person or a number of people, who are going, this is what we're doing and this is where we're going.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's what the leadership element comes into it,
Mm-hmm.
because, as a 21-year-old kid or a 25-year-old kid, I didn't have the experience. I didn't have the leadership qualities to say, right, guys, this is what we're doing wrong and this is what we need to bring together because we're going in this direction. Very rarely would you get maybe someone like a Wayne Rooney who could do that. It just doesn't happen very often. So it
Mm-hmm.
needs that really strong leadership, because also what needs to happen is someone has to be the boss, in my opinion. The boss has to be able to go, this is the way you're doing it, and this is the way you're not doing it to the ability we need it. Right, okay, this has to move out. And it sounds really cutthroat. And it does come back to, almost back to pitching for the contracts and how you perform in training every day. But it's such a cutthroat industry, game, sport, ultimately business,
Mm.
that if you're not doing your job, you're gone.
So you've taken those principles from the football pitch and you've applied them in the world of work. You wrote a book called "The Stupid Footballer Is Dead," and now you're working with teams to help them perform at the highest level. So what are the parallels that you see between the football pitch and the boardroom?
Yeah. So I think the best way to describe it is we use a framework called PACE. So obviously the fact that I know I look like a 14-year-old child, but I'm actually 46. So I'm very slow and old these days. But I used to have pace when I was younger. You wouldn't believe it, Dominic. I used to be really fast. But the PACE acronym, or the PACE framework that we used, is based on what a team needs to be. And this is not just a team. This is about world-class teams.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of teams perform at all sorts of different levels, and they have lots of different reasons why they don't get to the maximum potential that they could do. But for me, the research we've done and the best teams that I've ever been in, observed, or competed against, for example, in a
Mm-hmm.
footballing context, playing against the Arsenal team, who were the Invincibles around 2003, 2004, of going the entire season unbeaten, and to play against that team was just such a phenomenal experience, but also such a huge eye-opener
Mm-hmm.
of just what level of performance was across every area of what they did. So the acronym stands for performance, accountability, confidence, and execution. And that really, for me, just sums up everything that a team needs and what it needs to do. Because we are all performing, and this is where I find this really fascinating, Dominic. I had obviously a background in a team sport.
Yeah.
You could have been a golfer or a tennis player or whatever. But in a team sport, I think it is so, so crucial to be able to do your job. There's a really famous NFL coach called Bill Belichick,
Mm-hmm.
who's the Patriots head coach when Tom Brady was winning all his Super Bowl titles. But his simple mantra is, do your job. You're in the team, do your job. That's it. That's all you have to do. It's so simple. Just do the job that you're asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if everybody's doing that, then this team's going to be successful. The problem that I have with that is that most people have a really wide range of performance. Because let's just say, for me to walk into a Premier League dressing room, I had to be one of the best players in the world. And that's not an ego perspective. That's just
No,
to get to the top
fact.
that level. Same as what you did. You'd have to be one of the best actors in the world to get to the level you got to. But once you're at that level, you're surrounded by lots of players who already have that ability. And from my background, we had to have the athletic element as well. So I had to be one of the best athletes in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and a tactical understanding. But once you're kind of everybody's technically and athletically roughly around the same area to get to that level of a Premier League level, what's then the biggest differential in performance? And for me, it always came down to mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And that was where there was such a huge range between the players who performed at the highest level consistently and the players who could do it occasionally, but most of the time were just constantly on and off it. So when I talk about performance, yes, it includes all of it. But the number one thing that I believe is the only thing we should be working on in life is our mental performance.
Mm.
Because our mental performance drives everything we do, from the relationships you have, to the amount of money you earn based on what your value is of what you think you're worth, to the fitness and health you have today in your life based on the food and drink you consume, based to your self-worth, self-esteem, and it literally drives every single part of your life. And yet when I go in and ask organizations and talking about performance, talking about mental performance, and ask the question, so how much work have you consciously dedicated to improve your mental performance in the last 6 months, year? What do you think the answer is?
0.
Zero. Or this like tiny little percentage where someone at the back of the room
Someone
goes,
goes,
oh, I think I did some
yeah.
goals a couple of months ago, but I think they're in a drawer somewhere in the off. It's like, it's just such a underused element of what I consider to be the most important thing. So when we're talking about performance, I actually really mean mental performance. What are the
So
individuals in the team doing to improve that side? Yes.
yeah, so for people that are listening and maybe kind of struggling with that kind of imposter syndrome or self doubt, I love your honesty about being in the dressing room with Klinsmann and thinking, oh God, I don't look anything like that. I
No.
won't be able to have that career. What advice do you have for people? Where should they start in order to help them kind of move forward in the direction that they want to go in?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's normally the follow up question I get to. How much work are you doing? And it's not that I'm judging people, and I hope that I'm not coming across as judgmental. This
Not
is
at all.
just observations of working with thousands of leaders across the world over the last 15 years, and thousands of people who are going in trying to do their best. Most people I come across are trying to do their best. They just have never been exposed to this, and I think why I'm really fortunate is that I've had this opportunity to, be around world class performers. Not even just like someone like a Jurgen Klinsmann whenever I first arrived there, but even like our manager at the time was Ozzy Ardiles, is another
Hmm.
world class, Argentinian, and you just think people who have been at the highest level do things differently. So when you're asking what could someone do to improve what they're already, whatever level they're performing at, I generally say it starts with our beliefs. And even that probably is a whole other, day session, week
Yeah.
session. Just working, and it's almost like it's a lifetime's work
Mm.
to work on beliefs. So if I go back and give you my example of what happened with me and how did I go from this really shy, kid with an inferiority complex at 16 to playing for nearly 20 years at the highest level of professional football to doing what I'm doing now. I actually was given a book at age 17 by a friend of a friend. And so this guy, I'd known him pretty well by that stage. I'd met him about five, six, 7 times. And he just gave me this book by a guy called Tony Robbins. Now, I'm sure you and everyone who's listening will have heard of Tony Robbins. If you haven't, Google him, because he's a really impressive,
Yeah.
almost like a personal development guru from America. So my friend gave me this book in 1995, and I can even remember it now, Dominic. The book was this big red tome called Awaken the Giant Within, and the inscription was, to your success, Tim, November 95. And I remember reading this book, and it was just like, almost like my mind just couldn't take in all of the information that was happening, that I was receiving from it. That ultimately, the key message in the entire book was, stop looking outside of yourself, because everything you ever need in life, you've already got within. Now, for a 17-year-old kid to read that, that's pretty fundamental to life.
Hmm.
And what was really weird about the situation, and when I think back now, probably really weird about me, is that as a 17-year-old kid, A, I was open to reading the book. B, not only was I open to reading it, I read it and then started applying these principles.
Mm.
So one of the main things was around your beliefs of, what do you believe you can achieve? I'd already thought, I'm probably not the type of person who's going to go and play in the Premier League because Jurgen Klinsmann's the benchmark. But then he used this great analogy that says, well, a belief's just a belief that you have decided you're going to believe. And I was thinking, what? No, surely we all believe the same things. But of course, if you're growing up in England, you'll have a certain beliefs about how you
Mm.
do things, the way life operates. I grew up in a really challenging, almost a civil war in Belfast in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So I just believed it was normal for tanks to drive down your street, for soldiers to walk past you with their M60s and hit them across your head, for bombs going off every single day. I thought that was normal. So I believe that's the way you grew up. But obviously it's not, because as soon as I got to London in 1994, and you go to, North London, Enfield, leafy suburbia.
Yeah.
Where's all the soldiers? Where's all the tanks? It wasn't what everybody else was believing. So the analogy that Tony used in the book was, a belief is like a table, and the belief is the tabletop. And depending on how many legs the table has, will give the table lots of strength, and you'll really strongly believe in that belief. Or is that table a little bit wobbly, and is it actually just a wee bit shaky? Or can you actually wobble the table so that then can you challenge the beliefs, was ultimately what he was saying. And so I realized that the only person that was holding me back was me. And so to get that opportunity to go from, okay, so if I need to work on me, what can I do? And interestingly, it happened whenever one of my teammates actually made his debut for Spurs in 1997. It was actually, I think, around January 97, and he played against Manchester United, that sort of really famous, successful team of the late 90s with David Beckham and Ryan Giggs and Roy Keane, etc. And my friend, who I just trained 2 years in the youth team with, we both got our first year professional, and he scored against Manchester United live on Sky Sports in front of us at White Hart Lane. And it was like a little switch happened in my brain. And I remember just thinking to myself, we're all celebrating. Everybody was going crazy because their friend had scored against Manchester United. But in my head, I looked at Rory Allen and thought, if he can do that, then so can I. And within 3 months, Dominic, I'd made my Premier League debut, and I'd scored on my home debut, the same as Rory. And I think this is the things that we have to do to constantly work on ourselves to allow us to achieve what we want to in life.
Yeah. Amazing. Paul, I could talk about this all day. It's been absolutely brilliant catching up with you. Final question. If I could take you back to meet that 11-year-old boy getting scouted for the first time in Northern Ireland, what's the one piece of advice that you give him?
I don't know if it's advice is the right word, but as you were just asking that question, the only thing I could think of is, if I could say something to my 11-year-old self, it would be, Paul, you don't realize how much fun you're in for. Honestly, Dominic, to go from kicking a ball around the street in Belfast, and then my first boss at Spurs was actually Alan Sugar. Alan Sugar. So whenever he said, Paul, can we pay you some money to come and kick a ball around? And I was like, okay, yeah, sounds good. And then you're sort of good enough that you actually make your Premier League debut. And then, of course, you're at that level, and they go, can we pay you some more money to kick a ball around with your friends? I'm like, yes, please. And then whenever I left Spurs, I went up to Norwich City, and you might know the owner of Norwich City is an amazing woman called Delia Smith.
Yeah.
Delia said, Paul, can we pay you some money to play football for us? And I'm like, yes, please. And I did that for 70. And Dominic, you see where the story's going. For 20 years, people like Alan Sugar and Delia Smith have been paying me money to kick a ball around with my friends. And of course, it didn't stop there. In 2010, I then went down this career of keynote speaking. And now all these crazy executives and big multinationals around the world go, can we pay you some money to talk about kicking a ball around with your mates? And I'm like, yes, please, I'll do that. So at some stage, as my mum says, when am I going to get a real job? And I'm like, well, 46 and I haven't got one to this point. Yeah. So see how long it lasts.
I try not to. Paul, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Pleasure, Dominic. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Why Life's a Pitch podcast. If you'd like to improve the way you pitch and communicate, I'm giving away a special gift to all my listeners. We've developed the Pitching with Impact scorecard to help you benchmark your pitch performance in 6 key areas. It will take you less than 5 minutes to complete, and you'll receive a detailed, personalised report packed full of insights and ideas to help you improve and grow. Just head over to dominiccolenso.com/scorecard to get started.